argument construction and rebuttal. So I'll cover four main things in this. Firstly, on how to construct and structure arguments. Secondly, how to respond to them. Thirdly, you can ask any questions you want, and then we'll move into a practice debate. So starting with the elements of an argument, there's four main things that you should cover in an argument, and this is the structure that you should use moving forward. Firstly, the claim, which is the headline of the argument. Secondly is the proof or the analysis, giving the reasons why an argument is true. Thirdly are the examples and illustrations that ground your argument and demonstrate that it's plausible in the real world. And finally, the impacts and end outcome of that argument. Now, why is using the structure important? I'm sure you all have your own styles and your own unique ways of presenting arguments, but this is the skeleton that you should use for two reasons. Firstly, it helps make better arguments. You make sure that you're ticking all the boxes in terms of providing the reasoning as to why the argument is true, providing the illustrations to make sure that your argument is plausible and well-grounded, and also providing the impacts to demonstrate that it's really important and impactful in the debate. So it makes sure that you're covering your ground in that sense. But also it's easier to understand for a judge. You need to understand that in debating, you're speaking to imperfect people with imperfect abilities to note down what you're saying, and they're not going to be able to understand and write down everything that you say. And so it's important when you're speaking in debating or speaking outside of debating to someone and using your public speaking skills that you make it as easy as possible for them to understand what you're saying. And the easiest way to do that is to structure it in a way that's logical, that goes from your premise to the reasons why something is true, to the impacts and to the examples in that particular order. So let's get started. Firstly, with the claim. This is the headline of the argument and summarizes the end goal of the argument concisely. So for the motion, this House would impose a sugar tax, you would have a headline potentially of imposing a sugar tax will lead to less consumption of unhealthy food. And that's the main claim that you're making. And then you provide reasons as to why that claim is true. This should also be used as part of your signposting. So at the start of your speech, you should ideally start off by saying, in my speech, I will firstly respond to the previous team's arguments, and then I'll discuss argument X and then argument Y. And that's a good way to start your speech, as I mentioned before, for feedback for a lot of people, because it just provides a nice structure to your speech and gives the judge an idea as to what you want to cover in your speech. And so inputting these one-sentence claims into your signposting at the start of your speech will be really useful for the judge. Now, the second thing, which is the main part of the argument, is the proof or the analysis. This is where you give reasons why the claim is true, and prove the argument and prove why it's going to happen. And the more reasons that you can provide, the better. Not way too many, but 2 or 3 is something that's you should ideally hope for. And the reason why you should give as many reasons as possible is because when someone's responding to your argument, then they need to deal with all of those reasons, because even if they respond to one of those reasons, if the other 2 reasons are still true, then your argument still stands to a large degree. And so the more reasons that you can provide, the more you're hedging your bet against attacks that will come against that argument. Now, you should think of each strand of analysis and each line of reasoning as a chain of logic that takes you from point A, which is your premise that, let's say you're passing a sugar tax, to point B, which is people eat healthier food. And your analysis is taking me or taking the judge through that journey and taking them from point A to point B by laying out the staircase in front of them. So, for example, if you wanted to prove that people consume less unhealthy food if you pass a sugar tax, you say, when you pass a sugar tax, that increases the cost of food because corporations need to maintain their profit margins. And so when they're getting taxed, they need to increase the cost of their food to make up for that. But the fact that people have a limited amount of money, the fact that they budget their money, and so they only have a certain amount of money to spend on groceries, means that they're going to be far less willing to buy expensive, unhealthy food that contains sugar once it becomes more expensive. And therefore, they will opt for healthier options or consume less of that unhealthy food. So providing those 4 steps in between will make it a lot more plausible to the judge when you say a tax will reduce the consumption of unhealthy food. And instead of skipping those steps, you should provide that analysis to make it far more plausible for the judge to believe that. Or secondly, if you want to demonstrate that companies will change the way that they manufacture food, you could say companies are profit-driven. A sugar tax reduces the demand for their goods because their goods become more expensive, and this hurts their profits. So they're likely to want to change the recipes for their food to reduce the amount of sugar in them such that they get taxed less, and therefore they can maintain their profit margins. So that produces healthier food, which leads to people consuming less unhealthy food, less sugar, etc. So this is the line of reasoning that you should use to demonstrate why an argument is true. Thirdly is examples and illustrations. And this isn't substitute for analysis. You should still give reasons as to why an argument is true and shouldn't just rely on examples. But examples are an important part of grounding your argument in reality beyond just the abstract logic. And this means providing real-world evidence to support your argument. And you shouldn't research things during a debate. It's meant to be impromptu. So try not to search things up online. But if you do have special knowledge about a particular topic, or you've read something about that topic before, and you have a broad statistic or a fact that you know, then you should use that. But even if you don't have specific statistics, what you can use are illustrations. So you describe a particular situation and describe how an individual might be affected by the incentives at play and how that might lead them to act. So describe the thought process of a consumer who walks into a store, who sees that their sugary foods are now much more expensive and sees that therefore they should opt for healthier foods since the profit and just the monetary incentive guides them to do that. So you can incorporate that throughout the analysis to make it very vivid and clear to the judge what exactly this looks like, what exactly the the profit incentive looks like for the average individual who has a limited amount of money, who walks into the store and wants to buy their groceries. The final thing is impacting. Even if you prove your argument, if you've proven that people eat less unhealthy food, you should still go the step further to demonstrate why that's so important. And you do that by saying things such as this leads to a healthier diet, which reduces the chances of obesity or heart attacks, or it reduces the load on the healthcare system when far fewer people get sick. You want to characterize the various tangible harms and benefits that your argument will lead to beyond just people eating less unhealthy food, because ultimately the judge is going to be comparing various arguments and impacts that occur throughout the debate. And if you can make it very vivid and clear that this will lead to less loss of lives, this will lead to less heart attacks, this will lead to far more robust healthcare system, then that's something that's going to help the judge understand that this argument is something that they should care about. So that covers how you construct arguments. It would be really good to see you all trying to establish the structure when you discuss arguments in your speech, and really planning around the structure when you write your arguments in terms of what is the claim, what are the 3 reasons why this argument is true, and what is the impact, and potentially what is the example to back it up. Are there any questions about any of that so far?
Can you just go to that slide which had the overall structure once?
Yeah, definitely. So the claim, which is the headline, which summarizes the argument, the proof and the analysis, giving reasons why an argument is true, the examples and the illustrations, which ground it in reality or show a precedent for that argument, and finally the impact and what the carry-on harms or benefits are on society and on people.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? All right, if not, then I'll move on to the second thing, which is the elements of rebuttal. Now, just as you constructed arguments using this method of proof and analysis, giving examples and illustrations and impacts, these are the very same things that you should seek to attack when you want to respond to an argument, because those are the cornerstones of what's holding that argument up. So in terms of attacking analysis, in the same way that analysis is a chain of logic that takes you from point A to point B using a series of logical steps, if you can break one of those steps and point out that it's untrue or that it's an unproven assertion and it's a missing link that in a gap that can't be bridged, then that's something that's going to make it impossible for you to get from point A to point B and will therefore not allow your opposition to access that particular impact of that argument. So you should always look for the unsaid assumptions or the unproven links that implicitly lie in that argument, that the argument relies on to actually prove its end outcome. So as an example, the argument that we tried to prove here, which is that people have a limited amount of money and therefore when the cost of food increases, they will consume less of it. You might argue in the opposition that this is untrue. People don't have a limited amount of money. They usually just buy things not on a budget, but based on their habits. So if you consume an energy bar and Gatorade every day after soccer practice, then you're going to just walk up to your favorite aisle, grab your favorite items, and then go to the cashier and then pay for it, because that's just something that you do habitually. You're not going to change those ingrained habits just because the cost of your food went up by 20 cents. And therefore, people won't actually consume less unhealthy food. They'll just spend more money. So that's a potential way that you could disprove that argument by picking on that unproven link that people have a limited amount of money and that they buy based on their budget rather than based on their habits. Yeah, so that was the example. In terms of attacking examples, again, this shouldn't be a substitute for attacking analysis, because even if you attack an example, if the analysis is still standing, the judge will probably still credit that argument because it makes logical sense. But What you can do in the same way that using examples grounds your argument in reality is try to hijack and reverse the example that they're using. So instead, so the illustration that we used previously of an individual who walks into the store, sees that their favorite item is more expensive and therefore goes to a healthier option, describe that, look, you do this every day. You just walk up to the aisle, you won't think about the price, you'll just pick up your favorite item and walk over to the cashier. So using that illustration against that argument, when you give that logic and support and use that illustration to support it, is something that's going to be useful in terms of flipping that argument and demonstrating why it's actually untrue. The final thing is attacking impacts. And this is where you accept that an argument might be true, but try to argue why its end impacts are ultimately not something that we should care about. And there's three main ways of doing this. The first is proving why an argument's impacts are irrelevant. So even if they're true, they're not relevant to the motion. Maybe an argument's impact talks about how this is going to lead to a lot of money for the wealthy and for business owners. You might argue that, well, look, this impact might be true, but we don't think it's very relevant. We don't think that we should care about helping the wealthy. We should instead focus on helping those who are disadvantaged. The second way is by mitigating, by trying to reduce the impact of the argument, even if you accept that to some degree it exists. So you might say that, look, this might lead to people having healthier diets, but this actually won't have a very big impact on health because your genetics or how much you exercise matters a lot more in terms of health. So the diet is really only a very small part of that, so we shouldn't care about that as much. So that's a way that you can mitigate the impact of the argument, even if you accept that it's true to some degree. The final way is by weighing. This is where you accept the full degree of the impact, but you just say it's not as important as this other impact that we have. And you could do that by demonstrating that one impact is more likely than the other, that one impact is more severe than the other, that it affects a stakeholder that's more important. All of those are things that you can use to demonstrate why one impact should be considered higher to another. The final thing is just general tips for how you should do rebuttal. What you should do is quickly restate the argument or the logical link that you want to respond to. So you should say, opposition said this, they made this claim, or they assumed this assertion, and this is untrue for reason X and Y. So quickly restating the argument will help the judge understand what exactly it is that you're responding to. And then when you give structured reasons using the method I described, then you're going to disprove that argument or demonstrate why it's not relevant to the debate. Another thing that you should do once you've mastered this is take the argument at the best case. Talk about why, even if the argument is true, why its impact might not be very important. And this is something that's very useful because in the end, this is a game and you need to hedge your bets. The judge might not believe your first response. They might think, actually, no, they didn't do a good enough job demonstrating why this argument is untrue. So by giving even if responses and saying, even if the argument is true, it's still unimportant, that means that the judge has a better chance of believing you because even if they don't believe your first response, if they believe your second response, then you still are able to take down the argument. And finally, you should flag the importance of the rebuttal that you do in the context of the debate. It's all well and good to point out missing links and missing assertions and misunderstandings that the opposition has, but then you should follow that up by explaining this means that opposition's argument on how this will lead to improved health for the nation is untrue. So flagging up that in the context of the debate is going to be really useful for the judge to understand what is the purpose of your rebuttal that you're doing and how should I consider that in the debate as a whole. So that's how you should do rebuttal. Are there any questions about any of that?